Here we are for another bonus round of the 70s versus the 90s. And in this round, we have Alan J. Pakula's All the President's Men versus Andrew Fleming's Dick. And both of these films deal with the subject of Watergate, that whole Richard Nixon scandal and shit. And so let's just go ahead and dive right into it with the first one, Alan J. Pakula's All the President's Men. You know, the starring Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford. Redford is Woodward and fucking Hoffman is Bernstein and shit. And so they, are the reporters for the Washington Post who uncovered the scandal of the Watergate break-in, the cover-up by the White House and all that shit and all the, the story of Nixon. I don't really want to get into that. If you want to research it, the internet, and there's plenty of books. Even the book that this film is based off of that Woodward and Bernstein wrote and shit. But this film is like, it was made in 1976. So it is fresh off of like, maybe like 3 or 4 years after this shit had, all fucking kind of come to fruition and shit, So the film starts in like 72 and stuff. So, or not 71. I don't, my dates are all fucking off or whatever. It's the early 70s. So by the mid 70s and shit when they make this movie, all this stuff's been resolved and, everybody knows what happened, but they still managed to make a movie that was very thrilling and intense, even though you knew what the fuck was going to happen, even, watching it today, when you know everything that's going to, all the history of it and everything, it's still thrilling to watch, especially as brilliantly directed as it is by Alan J. Pakula, coming off of shit like Clute. This was like the peak of Pakula's career because most of his shit is wildly mid. But, in the 70s, like most directors, they did some of their finest work. And, he's also working with, two of the top-notch actors going on. Dustin Hoffman, you can't really touch him, and if he's got to play an annoying character, he can fucking knock it out of the park. And, and Redford, as Woodward, the intensity that those two and the chemistry that they have and just everybody else too, like Jack Warden's great in this, Jason Robards has been, Bradley is phenomenal. Anytime Robards is on the screen, he commands presence and, just like lays it down and so Robards is fucking one of the shining stars of that. Even Martin Balsam's great, and then Hal Holbrook is Deep Throat, that whole, just, and even just how they do the little postscript at the end of the movie, it's kind of the shit that they waited forward the plot. Pakula kind of has the formula down, and then we move forward to Andrew Fleming's Dick, which is a comedy about the Watergate scandal. Clearly not the actual shit that happened. Whereas like it's nobody, even at that point in time in '99, they didn't know who the fuck Deep Throat was. They had not disclose that shit yet. And here we see, Woodward is played by Will Ferrell and Bernstein's played by Bruce McCulloch. And, they're a little off kilter. They become like, the kind of the typical like, warring fucking people and, always in disagreement, can't get along with each other type shit that Will Ferrell would always play, kind of like a weird, sadistic buddy comedy that's kind of a side plot of the movie. But it centers around these two 15-year-old girls played by Kirsten Dunst and Michelle Williams, who end up being the fucking dog walkers for Richard Nixon. And, they end up, what Michelle Williams' character ends up falling in love with Nixon, who's played brilliantly by Dan Hedaya. Like this is, the thing about this movie is there's so many great performances in it. Like Dan Hedaya as Nixon just fucking crushes, and even Sal Rubinek is Kissinger, and the a few other like fucking Harry Shearer is fucking Liddy, and this and fucking it's just those moments are fucking insane. But the movie just becomes just too much. There's a bevy of comedic actors that can just make you laugh, but the laughs don't seem as consistent the more you watch it and shit. And it just becomes just a way just to mock Nixon and really play on the word dick. And, they work it around where like these two gals are they're basically Deep Throat. And so that in and of itself becomes an absurdity. It's like, cause you know, you got to know some writer is thinking like, oh, well, you know, that'd be real fucking clever. Just, you know, what if, you know, Deep Throat were these two 15-year-old girls and they were just too ashamed to admit where they got their source from. And, you know, it's kind of funny, but to make a whole movie out of it, you know, it's got a great soundtrack and shit. And the chemistry between Kirsten Dunst and Michelle Williams is great. Like they're lovely in the film. You know, they do a lot of funny shit, but you know, the film is kind of basic as fuck when you put it up against something. You know, when you're tackling the same subject, you know, when you see it done very seriously, because you know, All the President's Men is also a film about journalistic integrity and the importance of the press to hold the powers that be accountable and shit, you know, especially if the president's fucking some shit up, you know, you want to know, you know, the people need to know about it and shit, you know. But then it also kind of goes into question, you know, well, how do you know, the means that you do it and shit, you know, whereas Dick just makes fun of everything, you know, it becomes a whole joke. And you know, in the 90s, you know, they were very much on a heavy like 70s nostalgia kick, so it gives you a way to like show these two cute girls in like groovy 70s swag, you know, gear and shit. And so I mean, I got to give it to All the President's Men, because like where Dick is a comedy, you know, but it's also trying to play on history and shit. So I mean, to make a movie as interesting as All the President's Men, where it's, you know, just the history of how it happened is like impressive in and of itself, you know, because you know, every time you watch that movie, you're just impressed at how good they fucking managed to make this a thrilling experience. And so, you know, because Dick is just plain old silly, you know, and it's meant to be. But the, you know, if you're gonna do shit like that, you know, it should be a little more. I don't know, because then you try to. They even have their little postscript at the end of the movie, you know, trying to tie it and make it look like these are real people and shit. You know, the theory of disbelief and shit like that. But you know, that's so. All the President's Men wins this round because you know that is one of the few like perfect movies. You know, as far as like storytelling, you know, with the moving image and you know, direction and the cinematography by Gordon Willis, and all the performances are great, because not all the performances hit in Dick, you know, but the ones that do hit, they hit pretty fucking hard, you know, especially Dan Hedaya as Nixon. That shit's hilarious. But whereas like All the President's Men, they make it where there's no actor playing Nixon. This is about the people that exposed this scandal and shit, and you know, they were a bit more professional than they're making fun of them in Dick, you know. So not to say that you can't make fun of shit, but you know, it gets to the point where it's just like you just don't give a fuck, you know. And there's some shit that you got to take a tad bit seriously, or not. I don't give a fuck. Who the fuck am I to say anything other than who wins this fucking round, which is All the President's Men. So if anybody's keeping score, that's 14-12. 70s are up by 2, you know. 70s keep fucking coming around the corner with a 1-2 punch, because like, man, that, you know, even if the directors making the film suck, in the case of like Alan J. Pakula, you know, like they still were doing their finest work in the 70s, because you could basically do anything. You could do shit like this, you know, where people were probably fed up with seeing, you know, shit about Watergate. They fucking, this movie comes out and fucking crushes, you know. So it's definitely heating up. These bonus rounds will pop up, but of course the main event next Saturday will be Jaws versus Lake Placid. So that one's going to be the hitters of all hitters. So 14-12, 70s. You know, like I said, if I've said anything wrong or you want to, you know, talk, whatever, comment, I don't give a fuck. Eviscerate me. We'll debate. That, you know, this is a fun little ride I'm going on. I'm just taking it day by day, however the fuck I want to do it. So like I said, these bonus rounds will pop up, and if you got any suggestions, let me know. And fuck it. 14-12, 70s, man, one of the greatest, probably the greatest. About to find out.